Good afternoon. Welcome to the latest Asian Impact webinar of the Asian Development Bank. Today the topic is harnessing data in the digital age for poverty reduction. Now, data has played an increasingly central role in promoting social and economic development, particularly for those at the margins of society. The COVID-19 pandemic, of course, has served to further highlight the importance of having data, moreover, good granular data to help design effective policies and responses. So today I'm pleased to introduce 5 experts who are joining us today to discuss how we can capitalize on innovative sources of data to ensure that we will meet the Sustainable Development Goals agenda of leaving no one behind. We have with us today Ms. Eva Lohovska. She is a senior data scientist at the World Data Lab. She's worked on many artificial intelligence projects with global impact. Ms. Hatai Chanu-Paurawat is the director of the Statistical Forecasting Division of the National Statistical Office of Thailand, where she oversees the compilation of social and economic indicators. Ms. Wilma Gillian is the Assistant National Statistician of the Philippine Statistics Authority, and she oversees the technical management of various surveys on demographic, income, employment demand, and labor force, as well as the compilation of statistics, including decent work, health, and poverty. Mr. Shamit Chakravarti is a principal social sector specialist leading ADB's engagement with the Pantawid Pamilyang Filipino program, that's the 4 Ps, which, as you know, is the flagship conditional cash transfer program of the Philippines. Now, they'll all be responding to questions, so please pose those questions in the Q&A bar on the right-hand side. You can open it up using the double speech bubble icon at the top. Of course, we'll look to answer as many as we possibly can, but please also click like on any existing questions and we'll get to the most popular ones first. Now, to set the stage for the discussion today, we've got ADB's Chief Economist and Director General of the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department, Mr. Yasuyuki Sawada. He's going to share with us some of the recent work on how satellite imagery can be used to provide granular, immediate poverty data that could complement some of the conventional surveys or censuses that we've traditionally used. Yasu.
Thank you very much, Karen. Good day, everyone. While slide is coming out, I'd like to start. The Asian Pacific region has made a tremendous progress in reducing extreme poverty. Over the past 3 decades, the number of poor people living below $1.9 per day poverty line in developing Asia dropped from 1.5 billion people in 1990 down to 263 million in year 2015. But these regional estimates, which I just cited, reflect the situation 5 years ago, year 2015. And unfortunately, a lot of countries do not compile their official poverty numbers on an annual basis. In addition to the issues on timeliness of poverty statistics, pinpointing exactly where the poor are or who they are is also challenging, as sources of data from which those poverty numbers are calculated are not originally designed to provide a very granular information that might be needed for policy targeting. Now the pandemic threatens to undermine what our region has accomplished in terms of poverty reduction for the past several years. We have to double our effort to ensuring that no one will be left behind. This would require us to embrace the concept of data revolution by capitalizing on both traditional as well as new sources of data for development. So moving to the next slide, a data revolution would require integrating data from various sources to facilitate a more nuanced understanding of development issues. Integrating multiple data sources can potentially facilitate transformation actions needed to respond to the demands of complex development agenda. At Asian Development Bank ADB, we understand the challenges that data revolution brings, particularly for national statistical systems. Statisticians at the ADB's Statistics and Data Innovation Unit are working closely with government statistics staff in developing member countries' offices to build their capacity to use innovative data collection method to compile data, development data statistics that are granular, relevant, timely, and reliable. So next slide showing that our effort for the past several years through the key indicators for Asian Pacific, one of our flagship reports, we featured a number of statistics capacity building projects that the Statistics and Data Innovation Unit manages. These are all products of a collaboration between our statisticians and national statistical offices or NSOs or our developing member countries and economies. And we strongly believe, especially nowadays, where data are at the core of decision making, the working together with NSOs is very important because they are at the forefront of producing official statistics used by policymakers and ensuring that they have the capacity to meet the data demand of policymakers. In this project, what we have done is to complement traditional sources of poverty data like surveys with a more innovative type of data, such as satellite imagery. So next slide, explaining granular statistics on poverty can empower policymakers and enable them to deliver improved programs and services for the poor and most vulnerable segment of society. For instance, initial result of the study to be discussed today were also used by ADB's Southeast Asia's regional department in order to identify priority areas to benefit from Bayanihan food program in the Philippines, which is a food transfer program several months ago. However, as I have mentioned earlier, achieving granularity typically requires increasing the sample size of surveys on household income and expenditures or living standards, an option that is not always feasible for national statistical offices, NSOs, for organizations that conduct these surveys. Innovation in digital technology present exciting opportunity to embrace a new paradigm of sourcing data for development purposes. In particular, application to use data from digital transactions, telecommunications records, social media, and remote sensing, including satellite imagery, are expanding. Data coming from such sources can be used to complement traditional sources of development data coming from household survey and expenditure surveys, and potentially addresses some of the limitations associated with the traditional data. In the case of poverty statistic compilation, satellite imagery is an excellent example of innovative data sources that falls outside the traditional paradigm of reference point used by NSOs. Recent studies show geospatial data and other information extracted from satellite imagery, when used to complement traditional source data, can provide richer insights on various development topics. Skipping the technical details, the methodology entails combining poverty data derived from conventional sources like surveys and features from satellite imagery that are potentially correlated with those poverty numbers. The satellite imagery features or patterns are extracted using a computer vision algorithm. So this is our study, core element of our study. Training such type of algorithm requires large volumes of poverty labeled images, which unfortunately we don't have because poverty data from conventional data sources like surveys are neither granular or high volume enough. Instead of training to predict poverty, we first trained the algorithm to predict intensity of night lights. Again, this is from satellite imagery, nighttime satellite imagery, because the intensity of night light is valid proxy measure of poverty, and these night light intensities are closely correlated with level of income and poverty. Since data from these satellite imagery patterns are more localized, the resulting poverty predictions are more granular than those derived from usual using conventional data sources alone based on household surveys. So moving to the final slide. So this is this is a poverty map we made using daylight as well as a nightlight satellite imageries. We applied the methodology I previously discussed in partnership with Philippine Statistics Authority, National Statistical Office of Thailand, and World Data Lab. Statisticians from Statistics and Data Innovation Unit from ADB's Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department. The results were recently published in a key indicators for Asia and the Pacific supplement. And now you are showing a really final result of a granular poverty map on your hand. Using publicly accessible satellite imagery, whose resolutions are not defined as those in proprietary images, the study produced predictions that align with the government published poverty estimate after calibration. This finding implies NSOs or other government agencies that collect the poverty data can streamline their resources and avoid substantial upfront cost by capitalizing on publicly accessible satellite imagery, affordable cloud services, and computational tools. Further gain may also be achieved by integrating other types of innovative data, such as those coming from mobile phone records, among others, if the objective is to introduce more granularity beyond spatial disaggregation of poverty statistics. This will require forging partnership across multiple stakeholders. So with that, I'd like to stop my initial presentation summarizing our recent special studies, key indicators Asian Pacific supplement, in which we made a very granular poverty map using satellite imagery. Thank you very much. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you very much for that, Yasu. I mean, you mentioned during your presentation there that satellite imagery is becoming cheaper and indeed is often accessible for free. I'd like to turn to Eva first of all, if I could, because this satellite imagery data does provide, huge potential for development actions and so forth. And World Data Lab, of course, does advocate the use of big data, artificial intelligence, and emerging technologies. Eva, could you tell us a little bit about, how the use of satellite imagery has evolved over time and some of the novel uses in the field of development?
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, I'm super happy to be here. So exactly, we at World Data Lab believe that the future of data is granular and forward-looking. And one of the ways we're able to achieve this is by using actually the satellite images and the geospatial analysis technology. So based on your question and tracking exactly how this technology has evolved over time and how we could achieve that level of granularity and precision, well, the reality is that technological advances are making technology cheaper and easier to access than ever before. And the improvement in areas like computing power and high performance compute, AI innovation, algorithms, alternative data sources, and most importantly, open source technologies, completely revolutionizing the way we use satellite images, and of course, computer vision in general as a higher field of the advantage. So, for example, in the 1973, images were first processed to demonstrate seasonal vegetation changes. This information now helps to monitor vegetation health and track drought around the world. Images also provide evidence of compelling stories about the power of disasters. And in the 1986, I believe, combined data models from satellite images and weather data track the plumb of radiation over the explosion of Chernobyl. And most recently, geospatial data helps track the changing human footprint across the globe. And this includes rapidly growing cities or urban changes and informal settlements. Increasingly, the images are also used to measure, identify, and track human behavior, not just for poverty, but for example, in the most recent one in 2014, and the use of high revision images. This is a very spatial high resolution field of satellite images. The greediest details of places where people were moving missiles or digging up natural resources, cutting down forests and parking cars for shopping can be analyzed. And this is some of the areas where the whole technology is evolving. So focusing on your second question, for example, is what are the novel uses of this technology for the developing area most recently. Geospatial data has tremendous potential for working in various aspects of development. And for example, satellite images can provide useful data that complements traditional data collection mechanisms such as census and surveys. As we have been using this in the AI-based poverty mapping, as you can see, in a combination with daylight and nightlight images to identify poverty, then to identify how poverty looks like. And this is all based on the AI algorithms we have used and that are consuming those satellite images. The more granularity you provide and the higher quality images, then the more details you can get out of it. And you can get up to 50 by 50 centimeters per pixel on an image that would provide tremendous amount of information actually to achieve those results. And of course, this is not the only area of novel use for development world. It can help supply chain and improve the information for disaster response, or track deforestation by measuring the evolution of forest cover over time. And of course, help with urban planning and supply chain networks by monitoring urban growth. And this was an area that we saw growing rapidly during the COVID situation, where supply chain and networks were affected quite heavily. So there are some really novel and recent developments in this area that are showing very interesting results. And for example, for sustainable fishing and catching tax evaders are new areas of innovation where geospatial analysis help a lot, or observing human rights situations around the world, or spotting undeclared nuclear power plants. And of course, helping law enforcement and emergency teams is really the state-of-the-art technology that we are using right now to actually localize missing people. And of course, if you can localize missing people on such level of granularity, you can also identify ghost cities on the map and monitor oil reserves and many, many other areas where the granularity is even higher. And those are just a snapshot, a small set of the areas where we see the technology being used and making a huge, tremendous impact for the developing world and for poverty in general. And I would be more than happy to give you more examples later in questions. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Eva. That, yes, a huge amount there to take into consideration, and all those developments over the last 50 years. Certainly a lot going on. I'd like to turn to Hatay, if I could. I mean, she, as somebody who works in a national statistics office, is really at the front line in terms of providing official statistics for policymakers, which include the need to ensure that data is rigorously collected, is accurate, and is reliable. But I think national statistical offices, increasingly recognize that they need to be using some of the data that Eva, you were talking a little bit about there. Hatay, can I ask you, you've been involved, I know, with ADB, but you're also doing a lot of other work. Can you talk about some of the work that you've been doing in this area? And I think this speaks to one of the questions that we've got in from Ming Ming, asking about specific examples.
Okay. Thank you, Kalian, and good afternoon, everybody. Before I answer your question, I would like to thank ADB not only for inviting us to attend this webinar, but more importantly, partnering with us on the project that was just presented earlier. It is a good opportunity for us to be immersed to some of these newly emerging data sources and techniques. In most 10 years, the Thai government has given importance to the integration of national information, including the use of the big data to create statistics for planning and decision making. This can be seen from establishment of a committee mechanism for the implementation of this country. Next slide, please. There are some use cases related to data integration and big data policy in Thailand. They use the ground survey data with the administrative data, remote sensing data, and OpenStreetMap data, such as vegetation index, nightlife index, land surface indicator, rainfall, road network, building footprint, and point of interest. This is for our some use case in Thailand. Next slide, please. A few months ago, there was an article published in Bloomberg, and the title was Satellite Image Gives Snapshots of Thailand Path to Recover, which enumerates some of the initiatives by our finance ministry, the Fiscal Policy Office. They use satellite imagery as part of the advocacy to use high-frequency indicators in policy making. One of the initiative sites in the article started in the first month of the year before COVID-19 started. In particular, data from Google Earth Engine were used to examine concentrations of nitrogen dioxide, which we know is a byproduct of burning fossil fuels. So, presumable, if there are more cars on the roads, or if there are more industrial plants operating, there would be higher concentrations of nitrogen dioxide in the air. On the left side of your slide, of your screen, you can see two small pictures. On the left show the nitrogen dioxide concentration over Bangkok metropolitan regions during the period of lockdown around March and April. And on the right of that picture, the concentration in May. The red spot in May indicate that there were increased concentration of nitrogen dioxide when the lockdown were eased. This demonstrates the potential of such tool to be able to track change in economic activity as we go through different stages of this ongoing pandemic. Not only the concentration of nitrogen dioxide to provide the early indicators, but we use nighttime light, building area, point of interest, and road range, which are related to economic variables. But the applications of satellite imagery are not limited to assessing how we are faring during this trying period. In fact, back in 2019, PNET, which is one of the leading geospatial data and analytics company, signed an agreement with the Geoinformatics and Space Technology Development Agency in Thailand, which is under the country's Science and Technology Ministry, to share recent and crowd-free imagery that can be used to guide national priorities like sustainability, resource, environmental management, urban planning, and food security. At the same time, the country is inviting on developing Earth observation capacity. Partnerships like this can ensure a more intelligent economy through the use of the big data. And one of your questions, the lesson learned, I would like to respond that question based on the experience with ADB study with use satellite imagery for poverty mappings. Indeed, satellite image are very rich data source. However, in the context of poverty mapping, conventional data source like household income and expenditure surveys has its advantage too, as they were carefully designed to follow the standard guidelines for measuring poverty that say, I guess what is important is that when we are working with these new sources of data, like satellite imagery, we embrace this method of data integration where we do not look at these various sources of data in silo, but instead look at the bigger picture and see how one of data source complement the other. Nevertheless, the use of remotely sensed data is not something that totally new in Thailand. Several decades ago, the Office of Agricultural Economics, Ministry of Agricultural Cooperatives, use remote sensing for land use in the field of area sampling frame to estimate the area yield, production, and other related information. Later on, they started using satellite data to forecast of planted area and crop production. In other words, data from satellite imagery have been with us for quite some time, and what has changed over time is how it's used and its applications. And I believe we have to embrace that fact if we believe that its application will continue to expand the future. A question that we should start asking ourselves is what kind of investment should we make at this point to ensure that we will be able to maximize the potential of satellite imagery data. And relating it back to the theme of study presented earlier, we should also ask how can we find a way to integrate data from satellite imagery with other data sources, a more complete picture of spatial development topic. The last slide, please. Ministry of Finance by Fiscal Policy Office, they produced the early economic indicator report on agricultural and heavy industry sector every month, using the new data source on big data as supplementary data to survey data or administrative data. From the slide, we found the heavy industry in the Eastern Economic Corridor or EEC, and in one province called Salaburi has higher production trend until now as the density of nitrogen dioxide increase. This is all my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hatay. Obviously, yeah, you mentioned the need for investment in some of these new data sources. And I wanted to ask Wilma, in the main, how do you think that statistics offices should be working with development partners, commercial partners, to perhaps develop the proper scientific rigor that would match that we see for some of these conventional surveys and censuses? Or are there indeed, other or bigger issues at play here?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Before anything, let me thank the Asian Development Bank for engaging the Philippine Statistics Authority in this project and for inviting us to this webinar. The question is very interesting, and perhaps there is no clear-cut answer, as I imagine the choice between going full speed ahead or slowing down and taking cautious steps would be context-specific. But before I elaborate, allow me to share the initiatives of the Philippine Statistics Authority, which explore the feasibility of using big data. It's already mentioned that we had a fruitful collaboration with the Asian Development Bank on the project discussed earlier, which attempts to use satellite imagery in combination with small area poverty estimates and machine learning techniques. And we are really thankful because the results are very interesting. And with the satellite imagery, we have more granular data. So in addition to this project, we have a good number of interesting big data related projects. So we started with the creation of a task force on big data for official statistics at the time when the Sustainable Development Goals was starting in 2016. So we have the following member agencies of the task force. Of course, you would see the logo at the bottom of the screen that you can see. We have the Philippine Statistics Authority, the House of Representatives or Congress. We have the Department of Science and Technology, the planning agency of the country, the NEDA, the Statistical Research and Training Institute, and then we also have private partners, telecom companies, Smart and Globe, and we also have the Senate and also a development partner like the Paris 21. So from then on, we have the following specific activities on big data. For one, the computation of Rural Access Index, SDG Indicator 911, from gridded population distribution maps, administrative boundary maps with urban-rural classification, and road network maps, also a project with the Asian Development Bank. SDG 911 is the proportion of rural population who live within 2 kilometers of an all-season road. Another big data project is web scraping in the compilation of price statistics and indices that started early this year, where prices of more than 500 commodities in the consumer price index basket from select online stores are regularly monitored. So currently, there are 12 online stores that are currently monitored, and during weekdays, web scraping is done once a day using an app that was developed in-house. There is also a project on the use of artificial intelligence and other remote sensing on agricultural statistics to identify and map aquaculture farms and estimate area and production of major crops, a project with the Department of Science and Technology, Advanced Science and Technology Institute. PSA also explored the use of citizen-generated data, or CGD, for official reporting of the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is a project with the Partnership in Statistics for Development in the 21st Century, or Paris 21, that has identified 81 Sustainable Development Goal indicators that can be supported by citizen-generated data and civil society organization and non-government organization data holdings. Big data has a lot to offer, but there are current limitations on its official use, including the following: the need to formulate data governance framework that would allow users and producers to use big data in a safe, secure, and sustainable manner. Secondly, human capacity and technical resources are scarce at the moment. And third, but not the least, there is a need for legislation governing and supporting the use of big data for official statistics in the country. Now, going back to your question earlier, I understand that the discussion on the potential and opportunities that big data bring has already permeated within the statistical community. In fact, big data per se is not new for us in the context of producing official statistics, as we have been using administrative data and business data, which can also be regarded as major sources of big data. Some of us, however, are understandably cautious in tapping other types of big data. For one, gaining access to these types of data, many of which are held by private organizations, could be challenging. Depending on data sharing landscape, there might be a lot of bureaucratic bottlenecks that one has to navigate his way around. Another potential issue is representativeness of these new sources of data. Now, core to our work is to ensure that the data we produce are unbiased, such that it can be used to make inferences about the general population. And some of us are concerned that this might not be the case for these new sources of data. Having said that, I would imagine that the concern of some NSOs is whether the field of big data is already mature enough to warrant them making investments, which are presumably not trivial in terms of resources that will be needed, especially at the present time, considering the various priority socio-economic programs of the government that need large resources to reverse or cushion the further impacts of COVID-19 pandemic. Doing pilot or case studies such as the one we have for the poverty mapping using satellite imagery project with the Asian Development Bank is a good starting point, as it provides rich insights on the technical and administrative considerations that national statistical offices like the PSA need to factor in as we attempt to integrate these new sources of data into our existing data collection systems. Thank you, Karen. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Wilma. I'm supposed to move to Shamit, but we have a question in here which I think would feed very easily and nicely into some of the issues that you've just mentioned. And the question from Raymond Adolfima is, have you done any poverty intervention programs using big data alone?
Actually, we have yet to see reports on the success stories on digital technology that was of benefit to poverty, specific poverty reduction. Specific poverty intervention program. However, given our current situation, the use of digital technology has been rampant or has become the new normal. In a report by the National Economic and Development Authority and the World Bank, A Better Normal Under COVID-19, Digitalizing the Philippine Economy, the use of digital economies such as digital payments, e-commerce, telemedicine, and online education is rising in the Philippines and has actually helped individuals, businesses, and the government cope with social distancing measures, ensure business continuity, and deliver public services during the pandemic. Given this, we may expect various programs to benefit from big data. But looking further ahead, the Philippine Identification System, which started with the pre-registration actually last Monday, October 12, which would be a big volume data, may be linked to government poverty programs later on. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. And I'd like to move to Shamit next, if I could. And it also, I think, speaks to a question that we have coming in from Karen Firshan about examples of using big data to target the poor. Shamit, you've been working on some poverty reduction programs, as we mentioned, the 4 Ps program, and that used the Listahanan, which is a household targeting database, and ADB has been supporting improvements in that database. Could you give some examples of how policies have been fine-tuned using granular poverty data?
Yes, thank you very much, Karen. This is actually a very interesting and a very topical issue right now. From the slide, you will see that ADB has been supporting the 4 Ps for the last 10 years. And the basic fundamentals or the basic pillars of any social protection program, I would classify them under 4 heads. The first is a good, credible targeting system which enables the country to maintain and update its social registry of the needy, poor households, number 1. Number 2, a good, secure system of transferring that assistance to the household, without leakage. And Ms. Vilma mentioned about fintech solutions in that regard. The third thing, of course, is if we are going to spend so much money on social protection, we need to make sure that there is some sort of a compliance verification to make sure that the people are using the money in the, in the agreed way. And last but not the least, we have to have regular independent impact evaluation. Now, the focus here is on the first pillar, namely the targeting and the social registry. The 4 Ps today, the Pantavid program today draws on the Listahanan, which was done in 2009. Around 4.4 million households have been identified, poor Filipino households who have children less than 18 years of age. They are the ones who are the beneficiaries. A second Listahanan was done in 2015. Unfortunately, there were certain gaps in the coverage. The third Listahanan was done, it was started in October of 2019, basically to update this social registry. But unfortunately, what happened is it aimed to cover 16.1 million households nationally. And you can imagine how much that would cost. That costs about $50 million based on estimates from last year. And the National Household Targeting Office of the DSWD, Department of Social Welfare Development, would have engaged about 38,000 surveyors who would literally be going to different parts of the country. So the survey started in November of 2019. By March of 2020, they had covered about 11.5 million out of the 16 million. And then, the COVID pandemic kind of started. The quarantines were announced, so that entire exercise had to shut down. And now, with effect from 1st of June, it has resumed. But then what are the problems? Already the data that was collected before COVID is now out of date. number one. Number two, it is becoming increasingly difficult for the surveyors to go into households and, spend 1 hour collecting data on, what is your income, what are the assets, what is your roof made of, what is the quality of your house, what material, etc. So obviously, if we had a system, where we could draw on some of the big data, the satellite data, some examples made by, provided by our chief economist and the representatives of Thailand and the Philippine statistical offices, it would have been much easier. May I move to the next slide, please? Just to show you the real challenge. So if you see here, if you see here, the 4.3 million households that was identified under Listahanan 2009, that was no problem. But although it's an old list, but then as the social amelioration program started, that was the government's big initiative to address COVID-related disruptions, the government wanted to reach out to about 18 million households. So the whole challenge of identifying about 13.5 or 14 million additional families who are above the poverty line, informal sector workers who would have been hit by the COVID, that was a massive challenge. And DSWD unfortunately had to rely on largely manual ways. Social amelioration cards were distributed by the local government units. It was collected, then somebody in DSWD would sit and deduplicate and so on. It was a huge, huge challenge. And of course, the fact that COVID, meant social distancing and quarantining, it made it even more difficult. So therefore, I think the key indicators focus on satellite-based big data, for regular updates, more granular updates is so timely, and it will really help all the countries, which really want to update their social registry so that they can, respond to challenges. Before closing, just one other example, I have been now asked to take on the processing of a big social protection project in Indonesia from next year. I mean, it has to be done next year. And there the challenge is, in addition to granular data, updated data on poverty, they are very keen to overlap climate risk data, climate change data, data on disasters on top of their poverty data, again to give the government a little bit of a head start to be able to respond to crises before they happen, number one, and when they happen, the government should have a ready-made credible list, drawn from satellites, drawn from earlier manual surveys, through which it can then reach out assistance to the neediest people in a timely manner. Thank you very much. I will close here and I'll be happy to respond to questions later on. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shamit. Thank you. We've got a lot of questions coming in, so I do want to get to as many of those as we can. So I'm going to start throwing some questions around, if I may, and if I could ask everybody to be as brief as is humanly possible, just because there is huge interest in this. You mentioned, Shamit mentioned the desire to get sort of ahead of the curve, but obviously statistics officers can't just take on the data and immediately use them. There's a question here from Dina who asks about what sort of programming skills or education is needed, perhaps at statistics officers, in order to put this big data to use. And if I could go to Eva, perhaps, to answer that, because you've been looking on a global scale.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a very valid question. So from my perspective, a bit more of a technical background, and that's why I mentioned open source technology during my slides. Some of the programming languages that are kind of a must to be able to crack this kind of innovation are Python and R. And then relying on layers like TensorFlow and Keras actually to be able to handle this data. And in this case, we are not talking about relationship databases, so the classical SQL databases, but more of a unstructured or graph databases that can handle this type of data, because images and speech and natural language processing itself does not fall into this numeric structured way. Therefore, if I have to summarize it, focusing on languages like R and Python. R is a very statistical one. Python is the really software engineering language that makes things much more sustainable, and adopting technologies like TensorFlow and Keras on top of it, or any kind of pie chart with a good knowledge of database skills would serve a good way of actually being able to handle this technology. I hope this answers the question.
It does indeed, it does indeed. And of course, skills and the ability to manipulate the data is one thing. Policies and legal frameworks is another thing. We have another question here from Pat, which I'd like to throw to Hatay Chinook in Thailand and then to Wilma in the Philippines. Wilma, you touched on this a little bit, but he asks about the implementing improved data collection. What sort of legal issues are there on, for example, data privacy? Yasu mentioned earlier social media data, housing data, telecoms data, for example. What do we have to consider in terms of making sure everything is done and collected and looked after safely? If I could go to Hatay Chinook first, please, and then to Wilma. I'll repeat the question. The question is whether there needs to be some legal laws in place or policies in place to protect things like data privacy when we're collecting some of this big data.
Okay. I think for my opinion, I think in Thailand we try to do the data privacy, not only the data from the other source, but including the big data policy, the privacy policy also, and we have the mechanism to work together among the agency within Thailand, but still working on that. I'm not sure that I answered the right question.
Mm-hmm. You did, you did. I'll move over to Wilma, if I may. The same question.
Hello, Karen.
Hi.
Yes, of course, as I have mentioned earlier, we actually have to safeguard the data that we collect by establishing data quality frameworks. And that's what we are working on actually. And the other one is that for the digital technologies and data to succeed in benefiting the poor, we need to have sustained partnership in capacity development, in advocacy, and support on special processing tools for big data between development partners like the ADB. This is one very good example of an initiative partnership. Because development partners, they have the technical expertise and the tools and technological hardwares. And the national statistical offices, which you have mentioned, are the producers and guardians of quality data and statistics, and overall coordinators in the production and dissemination of data and statistics related to poverty reduction, among other concerns. Karen, thank you.
Thank you very much. If I could just stay with you, Wilma, because there is a lot of interest in the Philippines. A question from Romulo asks whether the PSA board has passed a statistical policy resolution on the use of big data or indeed non-traditional sources of data for official statistics. Are there any policy resolutions at all?
Yeah, Ms. Karen, there is none yet, but we only have created the task force on big data for reporting official statistics. And one of the soon-to-be statistical policy related to big data, but it's not the ones that we have been talking about, but on administrative data. By early next year, we will be going to the PSA board to for the PSA board to pass what we call MHARIS, the mechanism for the review of registers and administrative data. so that the administrative data which we are using now and which we intend to use to complement survey and census data to be able to report the sustainable development goals, we will have this legal framework to review admin data and registers. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks very much, Wilma. Thank you. There is a question about lessons learned from poverty programs. I may go to Shamit if I could, because Shamit, you've been involved very closely with this 4Ps program. Could you just lay out very quickly for us some of the challenges and lessons?
Yes, I think, I'd like to reiterate, the 4 pillars. And again, good targeting system which is credible and which can be updated. Now here in the Philippines, the proxy means testing model forms the basis of the Listahanan. By the way, the national statistician of the Philippines, Professor Dennis Mapa, who is currently the head of the PSA, he provided inputs, I think, into all the 3 PMT models. So that is step number 1. Step number 2, for any poverty program, what is it that we are trying to use the public funds for? So in the case of the Pantawid Pamilya Filipino program, it is a conditional cash transfer program aimed at helping the poor Filipino household in improving the education and health profile of their children so that they can escape poverty. So it is to break the intergenerational vicious cycle of poverty. So therefore, once we give them the grant, 750 pesos for health and whatever, 500 pesos, 700 pesos for, enrollment in school, is somebody actually credibly tracking that? So for example, you get the education grant only if your child, number 1, is enrolled in school, and number 2, he or she is maintaining 85% attendance. You get the health grant only if the pregnant lady is going for regular prenatal, postnatal checkups, if children aged 6 to 14 are getting 2 deworming pills per year, if the families are attending the family development sessions regularly, only then do you give them the money. So that, you are nudging the behavioral changes. So in order to do that, you need a form of compliance verification. My examples are focused on the social protection program. Thirdly, are you able to reach the money to them in a secure, timely manner without any leakages? So Ms. Wilma spoke about the PhilSys, and actually, the PhilSys will be a phenomenal move forward because it secures the identification. If you combine that with fintech, then you can make sure that money is reaching the hands of the poor, seamlessly. The Aadhaar experiment in India shows that this is possible. Last but not the least, in any poverty reduction program, of course, independent impact evaluation is critical so that we learn lessons in real time and feed that back into the design and future implementation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shamit. Yassi, do you have anything to add on to that?
Yes, conditional cash transfer described by Shamit is very important, and I would say this is most important social protection program in the Philippines and other countries. So I'd like to also Shamit touch upon India's experience very briefly. So I'd like to share a little bit more about the Indians' experience. So India introduced biometric ID, and Indians' nationwide conditional cash transfer program called NREGA. NREGA is a workfare program. If you participate in work, then you can get a welfare transfer, cash transfer. And on a sort of experimental basis, there is biometrically authentication infrastructure called smart cards introduced. So this is validated by big data, or huge big data of a biometric nationwide ID. And then by introducing this big data and using this big data to target beneficiaries of a conditional cash transfer program, there is academic studies showing that delivery of this social protection program became much faster and also much more accurate. So I think there is a huge scope how public programs can tap big data, in this case, a biometric ID, administrative huge data, to improve service delivery and quality of outreach and the quality of a social protection program. So I just wanted to share Indian experience also to follow up Shamit. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Yasu. And you know, I'm loving the enthusiasm that I'm hearing both from yourself and from our other panelists with regards to the potential real change that big data could use in terms of gathering granular, reliable, regular statistics. So I'm afraid we haven't been able to get to all of the questions. My apologies for that. We will be posting the video on the ADB website, www.adb.org. So please keep an eye out for that. We will also share the link with everybody who has connected with us today. And of course, that will mean that you'll be able to see the slides as well. So with that, I'm afraid we must leave it. I'd like to thank you, the viewers, for your participation. Thank you also to all of our panelists and indeed to the technology that has made today possible. Eva Lahovska from World Data Lab, Atai Chanok Janawarapat from the National Statistical Office of Thailand, Wilma Gillian from the Philippine Statistics Authority, and of course from ADB, Shamit Chakravarti, and ADB Chief Economist Yasuyuki Sawada. We will be doing this again on a different subject in 2 weeks' time, so please join the Asian Impact webinar series then on the 28th of October between 2 p.m. and 3 p.m. Manila time. The title will be Asia's SMEs Beyond the COVID-19 Crisis. Experts will be discussing measures to help Asia's micro, medium, and small-size enterprises cope with the fallout of COVID-19 and indeed to thrive in its aftermath. So until then, thank you very much.